Welcome back to the Mystery Garage. In today's episode, we're going to jump into a very controversial topic. The deeper you dive, the more controversial you find. But it's something we don't often talk about this channel, and that's hot rodding an 8-valve. Let's jump right into it. Welcome to this week's episode of Mystery Garage. Now guys, I'm going to be open and honest with you today. I am trying out a new microphone to try and improve the sound quality of these videos. As you guys may or may not know if you're a channel watcher, I live on a fairly busy road, and when it rains a little bit, which it does a lot of in BC, and the roads get a little wet, the road noise is tremendous. So it's hard to cut it out of the background of these videos. So I'm hoping with a little bit of micro work, we can do our best to at least reduce the sound. So please bear with me as we learn to use this new mic for the first time. But today we're going to jump into the very controversial topic of the Volkswagen 8-valve. Now, why is it controversial? Well, there's a ton of keyboard warriors out there that use VW Vortex to drop their opinions about their experience with 8-valves, whether that be true or not. So I'm here to try and help you guys figure out what are the best ways to hot rod an 8-valve. Now, this is a very opinionated topic for me as well, so I'm just going to try and stay very neutral throughout this whole thing, but to help cut it out, because Volkswagen made 8-valves throughout the Mark 1, 2, 3, 4 platforms, I'm going to try and narrow it down in today's episode to talk strictly about the Mark 3 and Mark 4 2-liter 8-valve specifically, because I feel like there is a lot to cover in just these two engines. And I think that it's very beneficial to a lot of you guys who are looking to hot rod for yourself. Now, before we get started, what does hot rodding mean? Well, hot rodding by definition for me means doing something to gain performance out of your motor for very little budget. Using OEM things to your benefit, as well as using a little bit of aftermarket parts to get the most bang for your buck you possibly can. Now, that being said, I think there's a lot of different variations to get to where you want to go. Now, with this 2-liter specifically, or even any kind of 8-valve, they hunt around 100 horsepower. Some a little less, some a little more. This ABA specifically is rated at 115 horsepower from the factory, with I believe about 122 pound-feet of torque. Now, when you start talking about horsepower numbers, you know, can you get an 8-valve up around 200 horsepower, which is roughly doubling its horsepower? Yeah, you can, but it's going to take a lot of budget and a lot of money to get there, as well as you're going to have to probably look at either boosting it via a supercharger or throwing a turbocharger on it, and that's going to raise the cost of doing so. Even engine work alone, to bring some sort of NA build up to any kind of 200 horsepower number, if you're thinking about knife edging cranks, decking the head, port and polishing, doing a whole bunch of engine modifications, you're going to spend a budget in and around $5,000, which for most of the cars in this channel is why I highly recommend doing a VR6 swap or a 1.8T swap, or even that 16-valve supercharged build that we brought to the channel. Those things are roughly around the same money, but you're going to see quite a bit more horsepower to those type of builds. But that doesn't go without saying that the 8-valve has its place. They are incredible engines in a Mark 1, because a Mark 1 doesn't weigh a lot. You can get a lot done with an 8-valve in a Mark 1 and have a ton of fun. You do not need to do a 1.8T swap, a VR6 swap, or any kind of, you know, hybrid builds. If you don't want to, you can get respectable power out of a 8-valve, whether it be a 1.8 liter or a 2-liter. You guys saw in the Mark II Golf build we did a hybrid where we took a 2-liter bottom end, put a 1.8 head on it, and ran it that way. You can do the same thing throughout CIS as well, but for today, like I said, in today's episode, we're going to specifically look at the ABA stuff, as well as the later model Mark IV 2 liters. We're going to kind of dissect those. So let's jump right into specifically talking about this ABA. All right, guys, let's start talking about 2 liters. Now, there is a ton of information I'm going to throw at you. To best summarize this, guys, I'm going to leave a ton of information in the description. If you're interested in going down the deep rabbit hole of 2 liters, benefits of which parts, you guys can head over to the description section and see it written out where you can go over it slowly. Otherwise, I'm going to kind of rip through this to make the talking section of today's episode a little bit quicker. And ultimately, I'm going to make this hot rodding episode 2 episodes long. First episode, which is today, we're going to talk about what we're going to do, and then we're going to go ahead and tear down actually the top end of this engine, and then we're going to, in next episode, we're going to build it back up. I have a new bump stick for this engine, so we got a 276 cam we're going to throw in here. This also is run off of ABA 2-liter management from Mark III, so we're actually going to be able to chip the ECU. We're going to have a little bit of fun with that. And beside us right here, we have the Mark IV version of the 2-liter, which is actually the AEG, AVH, or the AZG. Again, that's a bunch of engine codes. Various difference is the Mark IV AEG was the very first switch from a tall deck 2-liter to a short deck 2-liter. And the change created a different engine code in which the AEG actually has a cable throttle body. The AVH and the AZG came with a throttle by wire, which is actually what this one is. Doesn't really matter because we're going to be able to swap it over to the ABA throttle body. But we're going to jump into talking first about the ABA. ABA came out in 2 generations. Came out with the OBD1 and the OBD2. This to me, guys, is like the 2JZ from a Toyota. This is the pinnacle ABA 2-liter, which is the OBD1. Difference from the VR6 where the OBD2 is preferred. In a ABA, you prefer the OBD1, which is the earliest version of these engines. Right off the bat, you guys are going to ask me, well, how do I tell which version I have? The very easiest way, there is some decoding you can do on the back of the block, but the very easiest way is if you guys look at your throttle body pinning. If you have a 4-pin throttle body wiring, that's granted your throttle body hasn't been swapped though, guys, but if your throttle body is still original to the engine, you're going to have a 4-pin throttle position sensor, whereas if you have an OBD2, you're going to have a 12-pin. So you're going to see a difference right out of the gate. But there are massive differences, both the internals as well as the heads, on the difference between an OBD1 and an OBD2. OBD1, for example, came with a forged crank, oil squirters underneath the skirts of the pistons. It came with dual valve springs and a bunch of other little things that make this engine pretty trick. Now, I can't tell you whether this is true or not, but I've heard through the grapevine many times actually that Volkswagen's original plan for the original transition over to the tall deck 2-liter ABA was to make this engine actually turboed, but they ran out of money and time and ended up raising the compression on it and putting the engine out as the tall deck 2-liter ABA, because why else would so much effort, forged crank, oil squirters, and a bunch of other things, dual valve springs, be put into a 150 horsepower motor? Because later on in the OBD2, they ditched all that, went to a cast crank, went to no oil squirters, single valve springs, and a bunch of other things. So the seats and the heads are different to accept different valve springs. So there's a few different variations of heads as well. It's the difference between an OBD1 head and OBD2 head is the seats for the springs are different. You'd have to machine a OBD2 heads valve spring seats to be able to accept the early dual valve springs. So I think if there's anything I haven't covered off, but like I said, rumor had it this was meant to be a turbo engine, so a ton of guys prefer to turbo these, and you'll see quite a few 2-liter turbos. This is the best one if you're going to do anything. I would highly recommend doing an OBD1 over an OBD2 just because of those benefits. You lose those benefits as it transitions into the OBD2. Now let's pretend this was an OBD2, had a cast crank, had single valve springs. Now that head mostly remains the same, but we then transition over to the Mark IV 2-liter, which keeps that head, but actually changes the bottom end. So remember how I said this was a tall deck 2-liter? This actually is the first version of the short deck 2-liter, using the same head roughly as the OBD2 ABA, on this one with some slight modifications. Now, the short deck version basically is actually a 6A, which is a 1.8T block, just with different guts on the inside. The head is actually improved with a different long runner intake manifold, actually a different profile camshaft, some lighter lifters, and a few other modifications that actually changes these two engines. Now, a lot of people believe that the Mark IV 2-liter actually has more torque than the ABA 2-liter, but that's not correct. They both have the same peak torque of 122 foot-pounds. However, the ABA sees that peak torque curve at 3,400 RPM, but the Mark IV 2-liter sees that peak torque curve at a much easier to use 2,600 RPM. So it comes in a lot earlier. Now, the bore and the stroke of these two engines is exactly the same, but where the change is made up is actually in the length of the connecting rod in the engines. It's actually exactly the same change of 18 millimeters in the connecting rod as you're going to find in the change of the deck. Now, it's also kind of rumored that the change from the tall block to the short block was actually done in order to save hood clearance, to actually bring the engine down a little bit in the engine bay to prevent needing a big bubble hood to go over the tall deck 2-liter. It also made it easier for manufacturing. They just had the 6A block to build for both the 2-liter Mark IV 2-liter as well as the Mark IV 1.8-liter T, but they just had to fit them with different internals and obviously completely different accessories and management and so forth. On top of those differences, there is also a massive difference in management. The ABA uses a distributor, whereas the Mark IV version, the AEG, moves to a distributorless system. Water pumps are different. There is no intermediate shaft in the AEG version or the Mark IV version. There's a bunch of other management changes. Thus, bolting in a Mark IV 2-liter into a Mark I proves to have its own challenges. Wiring is vastly different between the two engines. Motor mounts are different between the two engines. It doesn't have the same relief that you're going to find on a 2-liter ABA as in the 6A block would have the same challenges you would have in a 1.8-liter turbo by changing the mounts and such. So that's kind of the vague differences between the two. But it's believed a lot of the torque changes to bring the torque curve down actually is found in the intake being long runners as opposed to what they call a short runner intake, because it's all grouped where you can see that 2-liter and then solidifies into single runners from here. So it's a lot less of a single runner intake manifold. The difference in camshafts between the two, also a little bit of lighter rotating assemblies with different lifters. And as well as you're going to see a little bit of a difference in having a short deck, maintaining the same stroke and bore, but having a different rod length would actually make the engine wind up a little earlier. So you're going to see a difference in torque curves between the two, a little torqueier motor with a basically a shorter throw of the piston itself away from the crank, if that makes any sense. Somebody's ripping by there, sorry guys. But anyways, so what today's hot rodding episode is going to be about is, rather than taking the better camshaft that's in the Mark IV, we can better that even further by using a 276 TT cam, which we're going to throw into this, but we're going to use the lighter lifters out of this Mark IV engine, which I got this whole Mark IV car for like 800 bucks. This engine's left over. It's got kind of a high K on it, but it doesn't affect the intake manifold and won't affect the lifters, which we can take. They're about, I think they're 2 to 3 grams lighter per. So we're gonna go ahead and pull all those out since we're taking the cam out of this one. And I'm gonna show you guys, hopefully between this episode and next, of how we can take a bunch of cool parts off the Mark IV engine and put them onto the Mark III engine, get benefits of both engines. And we're actually gonna throw a new cam, kind of a big boy cam in this one, because it's only usable, it's got a I think it's a 114 degree lobe. It's only usable in the Mark OBD1 2-liter because of the dual valve springs, so we're going to get the benefit of that as well and try and pull the torque curve down a little bit. On top of that, these engines really respond to big chunky camshafts. So really looking forward to doing this, guys. Also, we're going to benefit from the change of cleaning this engine up. If any of you guys have ever seen a Mark IV 2-liter engine cover, they're really cool. So my intention is to go find one for this engine and really clean up this bay, because you guys can see right here where the intake comes down. I'm actually going to be able to change that intake to actually come out the other side and hide under the cover, which is going to hopefully clean up this side of the bay and this side of the bay to be clean. It's going to make the engine bay look a hell of a lot cleaner than it does currently, and I am super pumped about that because it's also going to give us the power differences between the two. So let's jump right into it. Hopefully you guys got a ton of information out of this, and again, like I said before, there is going to be a bunch of this write-up that I've grabbed from all over the internet, as well as my own personal opinions. I'm going to throw it down in the description. You guys can read it. And today's episode was just a dissection of the Mark III 2-liter versus the Mark IV 2-liter. There's a couple other things like differences inside the head from OBD1, which is a clean ported intake cross-flow head. The OBD2 version has a bit of a swirl pot, which is supposed to increase fuel mixture. You find the same thing in the Mark IV. Apparently there's even an OBD1 ABA head made in Mexico or released in Mexico. That's a combination of the two, gets the better valve springs with the swirl pot. The argument might be, and I'll put it in the description, guys, because I don't want to talk about it any further, but can you put an AEG head onto an ABA? Yes, but there's a lot less benefits than the original OBD1, and we're also going to throw in a different cam. So this is going to be a vastly superb engine than both of these, and we should be a lot higher in the horsepower range as well as lower in the torque curve, and we're going to have an awesome little motor. So first things first, guys, I'm going to tear down this engine in time lapse, and we're going to go ahead and tear down this one, and then we'll be ready to start talking about the build up to next episode. Let's jump right into it.
I'm overlooked, you just misunderstood. Like a clock, bet I put in the work. Excuses be lame, you just be missing them perks. Tighten up the work. Flexing while I'm fixing the quirks.
All right, as you saw in the time lapse, everything is stripped down, ready to go. I'll show you this one. I just want to keep it covered so nothing gets in it. But there we have it. The cam is out. The intake is off, valve cover is off. I'm actually going to, since I'm hot rodding it, I think under a limited budget, we can probably get a race header for this motor, and that'll really send the whole airflow to the next level, because we're talking about changing the airflow of the intake. We should have equal flow going out the back. And I think a race header would fit in real nice. I just got to check the supply on whether we can get one or not. And we do need to incorporate the fact that this is a Mark I with a tall decked block. So we have to try and get a race header that accounts for that. Anyways, here is the Mark IV engine, all swapped, or all stripped down, sorry. Intake's taken off, injectors taken out, all that sort of stuff. Also took out the lifters, which are now on the counter. So what we have here is all of the ABA stuff. And then here is all of the Mark IV 2-liter stuff that we're going to be swapping on. As you can see, I'm going to be obviously using the Mark IV valve cover. What actually is pretty cool is this, the oil baffle. I didn't realize on an ABA I've seen 100 of these, but this is actually the first time I'm ever doing this swap, by the way. I should say that out loud. But this here, I didn't recognize that the 2 liters from the Mark IVs have a further down baffle that kind of sends it back down right after it splashes through the cams, sends it right back down to the oil pan. So that is pretty cool. I'm definitely going to include this in the motor build. What else we got? We got the intake pipes. You need to kind of keep everything together. Obviously this all stuff only needs a major clean, which we're gonna get done. And I took these brackets off as well, which hold the engine cover. I'm obviously gonna trim them down so they're just minimal, so that way it still holds the engine cover, top, bottom intake, that sort of thing. I do need to do a little bit of investigation on the injectors, because the injectors seem to have a slight different bore size where they meet in the intake. So I may have to run this rail. If that's the case, I need different connectors for this injection. But nevertheless, we'll figure all that stuff out. Here is the new camshaft from TT. So you guys can take a look. 276 hydraulic cam, 114 lobe center. We have the 8 valve cammed chip from TT, as well as a new timing belt. I do need a list of things I need to get: upper and lower intake gasket, throttle body gasket, because we're going to look at swapping over the throttle body from the ABA over to this intake manifold. We're going to clean all this up. So upper, lower intake manifold gaskets, valve cover gaskets, need the oil seal for the cam. What else are we going to get? A couple other things: oil filters, plugs, all that sort of stuff. But definitely very excited about this one. It's pretty cool to kind of take on something new and exciting, and I kind of learn myself through it. I've done a ton of, educating myself on the Mark IV stuff. I've done plenty of ABA work before. So for me, this is a little exciting, and I kind of asked the owner of this car if he wouldn't mind me kind of hot rodding this ABA on his behalf, and he said go ahead and have fun with it. So I think this is going to be a pretty cool car. A combination of the cam, better air flowing intake, hopefully better air flowing exhaust. What else we got? Chip. Just a bunch of cleanup, probably some cleaned injectors, new spark plugs, all that kind of stuff. We should be able to see some pretty good performance gains out of this. And let's face it, the parts off of this engine, if I were to go to an auto wreck, would probably cost me at maximum $100. You got a cam, I think that's like a couple $100. I can't really remember what it cost. New timing belt, chip is probably $150, give or take. So I think all in all, by the time we're done this, excluding the header, will only be a $500 upgrade. And I hope to really see some serious, fairly serious performance gains. And the look of the engine will be completely updated once I get that Mark IV engine cover on. So super stoked about it. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you guys like this kind of stuff, highly recommend that you subscribe to the channel. Until next time, part 2 of this episode. We'll see you later.